We have learned that U.S. anti-doping authorities have given Lance Armstrong a deadline of February 6th to agree to confess all under oath. If he declines, we are told that his lifetime ban in sports will be irreversible. Armstrong admitted to doping for the first time in an interview with Oprah Winfrey last week, but the director of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, Travis Tygart, told us that Armstrong did not tell the truth in that interview and left out the most important facts that investigators want to nail down. Tygart is the official who pursued the Armstrong investigation when others had given up. The evidence amassed by his anti-doping agency forced Armstrong to surrender his titles, lose his sponsors, and quit his charity. Armstrong says he wants to return to sport. Travis Tygart holds the keys to that decision. So we asked him this week about Armstrong's talk show confession. You know, at one point in the interview, he said that he was curious about the definition of the word cheater, and he looked it up in the dictionary and didn't think it necessarily applied to him.
It's amazing. I mean, Scott, you could go to almost any kindergarten in this country or frankly around the world and find kids playing tag or foursquare and ask them what cheating is. And every one of them will tell you it's breaking the rules of the game. No real athlete has to look up the definition of cheating.
Armstrong described doping as so routine. It was, quote, like the air in our tires and the water in our bottles. What did you think of that?
It's just simply not true. And I think it's a pretty cowardly, self-interested justification or rationalization for his decision to defraud millions of people.
The U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, known as USADA, polices U.S. Olympic sport. Last October, it issued a report that's called a reasoned decision. It was 1,000 pages of evidence that found that Armstrong had run, quote, the most sophisticated, professionalized, and successful doping program that sport had ever seen. That was one of USADA's conclusions that Armstrong denied in his interview last week. He suggested that cycling in those years was a level playing field because everyone did it. He wasn't doing anything special.
It's just simply not true. The access they had to inside information, to how the tests work, what tests went in place at what time, special access to the laboratory. He was on an entirely different playing field than all the other athletes, even if you assume all the other athletes had access to some doping products.
Armstrong admitted in the interview to doping throughout his 7 Tour de France victories. He tried to make a comeback in 2009. He admitted the first 7, but those last 2 races in 2009 and 2010, he said he did not dope. He was racing clean.
Just contrary to the evidence. The evidence is clear. His blood tests in 2009, 2010, expert reports based on the variation of his blood values from those tests. 1 to a million chance that it was due to something other than doping.
You have to wonder why, if he admits to doping in the first 7 Tour de France races, why he would proclaim his innocence in 2009 and 2010.
I think it stops the criminal conspiracy and protects him and the others that helped him pull off this scheme from potential criminal prosecution, if that was in fact true.
How does that help him in that way?
There's a 5-year statute on a fraud criminal charge. So the 5 years today would have been expired. However, if the last point of his doping, as we alleged and proved in our reasoned decision, was in 2010, then the statute has not yet expired, and he potentially could be charged with a criminal violation for conspiracy to defraud.
The famous U.S. Postal team was fueled by dope. There was an illegal blood booster called EPO. There was testosterone and a banned technique called blood doping, in which riders store fresh blood and transfuse it into their bodies during a race. Records were broken, victories spoke for themselves, and for a decade, no one spoke of anything else.
The first break that finally cracked the code of silence or the omerta that existed in this sport was when several witnesses in the spring of 2010 came forward and they told us their stories.
You use the word omerta. That's a mafia term.
It is a mafia term, and I think there were parts of this scheme that were run like a mafia.
In 2010, the U.S. Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. Armstrong's teammates were forced to testify, subpoenaed by a grand jury. One of them was Tyler Hamilton. One of the things that is so amazing about all of this is how long it was kept quiet. How many people knew and didn't say.
Yeah, people were afraid of Lance Armstrong. People were afraid.
But what's to be afraid of?
It's the machine, the Lance machine. He's got a lot of connections. If you go against Lance Armstrong, your days in cycling are done.
The testimony of Hamilton and others before the grand jury in Los Angeles was secret, until Hamilton told his story in an interview on 60 Minutes.
There was EPO, there was testosterone. And I did see a transfusion, a blood transfusion.
3 weeks after that story in 2011, Hamilton was in Aspen, Colorado, working his way through a crowded bar.
Turned to my right and it was Lance Armstrong.
So he stops you cold.
Stops me cold,
And
yeah.
says what?
Well, first he asked how much 60 Minutes had paid me to do that interview.
Answer, nothing.
Obviously nothing, yeah. The biggest thing he said is, we're going to make your life a living effing hell, both in the courtroom and out.
He was, at that moment, the target of a federal investigation, and you were a witness in that federal investigation.
Yeah.
Intimidating a witness is a federal crime.
Yeah.
Did you feel intimidated?
I did.
The grand jury heard from at least a dozen postal riders. There was testimony that a team bus had been pulled over in France while the riders inside were hooked up to banned blood transfusions. Some testified that riders used makeup to cover needle marks. The secret grand jury proceeding went on for 2 years, but in 2012, the U.S. attorney dropped the case without explanation.
I was really angry. I knew, I'm not a rocket scientist, but I knew justice wasn't being served here.
You'd gone to the grand jury, you'd told the truth, and the government dropped the case. You're out there twisting in the wind by yourself.
Yeah. And I knew a lot of other people had testified, and it was all going to be sealed, and everybody was just going to go along like it had never happened.
USADA had been monitoring the investigation, and Tigert thought that the evidence gathered by the U.S. attorney was overwhelming. Why do you think he dropped the case?
I don't know, Scott. It's a good question, and one that if you find the answer, let me know.
Armstrong congratulated the government for closing the investigation and kept repeating what he told CBS Sports in 2005.
Explain to me how we pass so many tests if we're so dirty. And they don't want to answer that question. And that's not fair.
But Tigert did want to answer that question, and he began an investigation. He convinced riders to testify to USADA. He looked at Armstrong's tests from his first Tour de France victory in 1999 and found EPO. Then, a Swiss lab director, Martial Sauji, said that after he got a suspicious test result on Armstrong in 2001, he was directed to meet Armstrong and his coach, Johan Bernil. Sauji said the meeting was set up by the International Cycling Union, which oversees the sport.
He was instructed by UCI to meet with Lance Armstrong and Johan Bernil and explain the EPO testing process, which he told us was unprecedented. And I asked him, did you give Lance Armstrong and Johan Bernil the keys to defeat the EPO test? And he nodded his head yes.
Tigert believes Armstrong had influence over the UCI. Lance Armstrong made a generous donation to the International Cycling Union of $100,000. Do you think that was meant to influence them?
I don't know. Obviously totally inappropriate.
Why inappropriate? Lance Armstrong's trying to support anti-doping in sport. That's what he would tell you.
It's an inherent conflict of interest.
I didn't know